Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I would very much like to continue on with our journey, our discussions, our explorations with respect to the recent releases made by the Criterion Collection during this year of 2021. And that brings us to another remarkable, monumental work from the filmmaker Masaki Kobayashi. And this is designated by Criterion at spy number 480. So it is currently in the collection as a DVD set, but now this year Criterion has released it on a Blu-ray release, and it is the work which is from 1959 through 1961. It is known in Japanese as Ningen no Jouken, or in English, The Human Condition. This is the monumental, epic, landmark achievement from filmmaker Masaki Kobayashi. It is based upon the writing of Junpei Gomikawa, and it stars as the main character in the central role of Kaji. It stars the great actor Tatsuya Nakadai. This is, of course, the work which is called Ningen no Jouken, or in English, The Human Condition. As a preliminary matter, I should first point out exactly how I would like to approach this particular discussion. And what I propose is I'd like to focus in on the three components that make up the viewpoint of this particular work or cycle of works as a type of trilogy. And that is indeed how the Criterion Collection, from a certain point of view anyway, is presenting this work. The Criterion Collection gives this work one singular spine number, as said, at 480. However, it does present this particular work on separate discs. For the Blu-ray release, we have 3 Blu-ray discs. On disc 1, we have what is referred to as the first part, or part 1. And then on disc 2, of course, we have the second part. And then on disc 3, we have the third part. Now, the reason why, or to be general about this, the reason why we have certain viewpoints about it being, say, made up of different parts is due to the various release versions, either Japanese release versions or international release versions. And so depending on those points of views, one might regard this particular work as, say, 3 separate films that make up the whole work that is The Human Condition, or perhaps one might view this as 6 separate parts that make up the whole work, which is called The Human Condition. So it's oftentimes referred to or regarded as either a 3-part work or a 6-part work, or it's often regarded as one work as a whole. So depending on how you want to view this, I think there are many possibilities, and each viewpoint has, I think, a really strong justification or set of justifications. So I encourage you to consider the work, and you can engage with the work in terms of its 6-part structure, or maybe its 3-part structure, or its presence as a whole. And as a whole, then it runs, in terms of its running time, over 9 hours. And so in any event, my friends, what I propose is to try to structure a conversation or discussion of this work on the 3-part structure basis, because that is, of course, after all, how Criterion seems to be presenting it in terms of the release here anyway. The Blu-ray discs, 3 separate discs, each part on the 3 discs, and a set of supplements that accompany each of these particular components or these discs. And so, but still, I think Criterion also acknowledges, even in this 3-part structure, in the release, Criterion seems to be acknowledging that this is also regarded as one whole work. And that is, of course, indicated, I think, or it's implied by the fact that we have 1 spine number, not 3, not 6, but 1. That is spine number 480. That is assigned to the entirety of the work, the human condition. And so it is the entire work that is, again, made up of different parts. Again, depending how you view it, it can be 3 parts or it can be 6 parts. And so what I propose is let us take the 3-part structure and move forward with a discussion of this work by the great filmmaker, Masaki Kobayashi. And it is called Ningen no Jouken, or in English, The Human Condition. Now let us focus our attention to the first component of this work, the human condition. And this is often referred to under the title No Greater Love. And it stars Tatsuya Nakadai as the main character of Kaji in this work, which essentially is where we are introduced to Kaji and we understand, or we get a sense of the moral complexities and quite difficult and oftentimes horrific dilemmas that he faces in his particular situations and circumstances. Now, the backdrop is wartime Japan, and this is during the imperialist and militaristic wartime efforts made by the Japanese forces. Now, with respect to Kaji, this is, of course, focused in on wartime during, or it's focused in on Manchuria during the wartime. And this is very important and significant to the story of Kaji because we understand a number of things from the outset. First, we understand that Kaji has this very key relationship with this woman who's very important to his life, and we find out she's a very key character, and this importance and significance will be represented and expressed in a number of very interesting ways throughout the work, The Human Condition. But this is the character of Michiko, and so this is one component or layer of Kaji's circumstance and character. Another component is that he seems to be expressing or espousing a type of admiration for what he views to be, or what he deems or considers or understands to be, a type of socio-political and cultural utopia as represented by the establishment or the policy of socialism as espoused by Soviet Russia. And so this is an indication also of what is often described as Kaji, the character's left-leaning tendencies and his viewpoints in terms of the salvation types of effects that he views in terms of the idealized notions of his viewpoints that have to do with his outlook on socialism. And so this is also very important too, because we will see throughout this particular component, and indeed throughout the entirety of The Human Condition, how this viewpoint changes or alters or is affected quite fundamentally based on the actual and difficult and quite horrific circumstances that he is faced with or he has to confront throughout his entire story, or the entirety of his story. This is another element that we see from the outset. And yet another element of Kaji's character or story or concern is that, again, this is wartime Japan, and so he is of age to be eligible to have to serve in the Japanese military. He expresses, however, certain perhaps views of pacifism or beliefs in pacifism, but we also understand that this expression of pacifism and having a refusal or a stance of refusal to serve in the Japanese military comes with it a very heavy penalty and price. And so there is already a certain sense of dilemma that is confronting our main characters here, Kaji included. That is, how does one express one's belief in pacifism if it means, say, a severe punishment of incarceration? And so does that mean that one is willing to give up one's freedoms for the sake of one's ideals and principles? Now, this is one way of expressing this type of dilemma or condition that is, I think, exemplified or is shown to be is shown through many examples throughout the entirety of the work of the human condition. But here we have already at the very start this expression of the dilemma. What to do in this particular circumstance of wartime Japan, when one does not want to serve and yet one is faced with certain grave circumstances if one refuses to do so. And here we have a very interesting development from the very outset of this first component of the human condition. Namely, we understand that he works for a certain it's described as being a steel company. And so we understand that this company, this Japanese company, is very much devoted to its efforts of mining these materials that we assume will be part of the industrialized mechanisms that are being employed for the Japanese military wartime effort. And so we have this situation where Kaji is working not for, or he's not enlisted in the military per se, but he is working for a company that seems to be engaged with certain efforts that are linked to the wartime efforts. So then, therefore, the question already arises in terms of the solving of this particular dilemma. Does Kaji find the solution, or is his solution somewhat murky and somewhat ambiguous, and thus somewhat either from one viewpoint nuanced or from another viewpoint quite stained and quite defective in terms of its stance in morality? So there are already questions abound from the very get-go. But this is very important in terms of a plot driving force, because we understand also that if Kaji gets an assignment to be head of the labor in the company's mining efforts in Manchuria, and so if he agrees to this particular post, then what this means for him is he is exempted from having to serve in the Japanese military. And so this forms the character basis of Kaji as a type of pacifist, but who is faced with the dilemma of either service or non-service exemption. But in order to achieve that, he must work in terms of the labor efforts for this mining operation that is obviously directly involved with the Japanese wartime effort. And so already we have a number of very complex details that are emerging there. But here we have the establishment of Kaji, someone who seems to be trying to find some kind of answer to these very difficult and complex questions that are arising due directly to the wartime effort. Now the work then focuses in on his efforts in charge of the labor, the workers that are working are assigned to particular aspects of these mining operations. And what this means is Kaji has to confront a number of various levels that, again, have direct links to the wartime effort. So one of these levels is working in the context of the authoritarian arrangement of power that is already established within this context of the Japanese mining company and its operations. And we see how certain figures that Kaji meets seem to be abusing their power, seem to be engaging with very harsh techniques that can be described as being quite cruel and inhuman. And this becomes even more complicated and complex when the film indicates that the labor is going to be supplied by the Japanese military, or under the control of the Japanese military police known as the Kempeitai. And this supply of labor is in fact prisoners of war, Chinese prisoners of war that are already, we understand, confronting or having to be, or in these really terrible, cruel situations before they even arrive at these particular mines and these particular mining operations. And it is this group of prisoners, Chinese prisoners, that also need to be subjected to very harsh prison-like treatment within the mine, and also with Kaji at the head. And so this therefore is the war, or the aspects of war that are horrific and cruel, that involve the treatment of prisoners, that involve the labor, that involve the use or abuse of power, that involve political structures, that involve the hierarchy of authority and power, that involve the clash between military and civilians, that also involve the clash between two sides of the war. Nationalities are also subject to discussion and debate. And also in this we have the role of Kaji, who is, as I say, based on the establishment of his character that we see him in, or the state in which his character is in at the very start of this particular work. This is a very, very difficult terrain for him to navigate. And so we therefore see his efforts in trying to create a sense of a humane environment in terms of the treatment of these prisoners, these laborers, how his efforts might succeed or fail in that attempt, how he is trying to confront certain other figures in authority, how the Chinese laborer prisoners view him, how he views the prisoners, how that is also not an easy alliance in and of itself, how he also is trying to deal with his relationship with Michiko, the woman of his life, and also the pressures of the Kempeitai and what it is they bring, and the horrors of war and military authority that they represent in the eyes of Kaji. And so all of this is presented in this first part, and we see what Kaji is confronted with specifically, how his interactions with certain people have what might seem to be, or those interactions might at first seem to be quite inconsequential and quite minor in the grand scheme of things, but in fact they have potentially these large rippling effects, and these little things, or seeming little things, have these huge consequences that can mean life or death. And so in this way, the focus on Kaji is a very nuanced and complex one, because on the one hand we understand that Kaji is trying to espouse certain aspects of humanity or the humane, and this is again based upon his allegiance, if you will, to the principle of pacifism, and also in his viewpoint of the utopian ideal of socialism, and how he tries to translate that into real terms, in terms of how he's trying to, in his eyes, help the Chinese prisoners in this particular horrible terrible situation. On the other hand, we also see that his decisions have consequences either to himself or to people around him, or in the way that people view him. And then that leads to further questions or further dilemmas or further issues of states of being and how one views one's role. Is it truly possible to achieve a sense of moral righteousness in this particular situation, or is that indeed an impossible goal? And if it is indeed an impossible goal, then what is a person like Kaji to do in this particular situation? And all of these dilemmas are presented in these stark and frightening and very realized terms in the various episodes that we see Kaji and the people around him confront and face throughout this entire first component. And it's very gripping. There are moments here that are so gripping and suspenseful, and they are suspenseful from a certain filmic or maybe sort of cinematic way, but they are also very suspenseful and very gripping from the viewpoint of the types of cause and effect that we as viewers can sense in terms of the real threat that these situations pose with respect to the morality of the characters, including Kaji himself. And so we have here in the first part a gripping and incredibly profound set of circumstances that are presented in a very direct and indeed bleak way. But this is very important because this is one way or one aspect that the writer Gomikawa and the filmmaker Kobayashi are trying to emphasize, which is we have a character that seems to be very much away from the war effort directly, but he is, of course, in a situation where he cannot escape or evade responsibility, and he cannot escape or evade his connections to the wartime effort of the imperialistic and military or militarized Japan during wartime. And so what does a character like Kaji do in this particular situation? And that is one of the aspects that makes the human condition, and indeed this first part, oh so compelling. And we must point out too that we see Kaji in a certain state of mind and a state of emotion, and we see him in essentially what could be described as Kaji in his private civilian life. And yet even in this private civilian life, his world is drastically affected, and his viewpoint and his philosophy is challenged to its very, very core. So this is, I think, very key too, because as we progress through the portions of the human condition, we will see Kaji in very different states indeed, not just in the state of being a civilian, but perhaps also in the state having more direct contact with the life of a military soldier and what lies beyond that. And so here we have the first component, which is presenting us with this viewpoint of Kaji. And so in these ways, we have set up here in a most remarkable and staggering and thought-provoking way a series of story plot lines that could be described as being a set of dilemmas or a set of challenges that are perhaps insurmountable, and the types of cause and effect situations that lead to the complexities of positioning oneself in terms of morality. And this is certainly the case of Kaji during wartime Japan in the situations that he finds himself in this first component of the work, which is the human condition. I should say now that this disc 1 of the Human Condition Criterion Collection release has this first component, part 1 of 3 as it were, No Greater Love. And then it also has a number of supplements on said disc 1. And what are those supplements? So the first supplement is an excerpt of an interview discussion with the director Masaki Kobayashi. And this is a discussion between Kobayashi and also Masahiro Shinoda. And Shinoda's name will appear, in fact, in a discussion of another aspect of this Criterion release. But for now, we have this wonderful discussion, or an excerpt of this discussion, between Kobayashi and Shinoda. And this is described as being from 1993, the Directors Guild of Japan talk with Masahiro Shinoda. And it's approximately 13 minutes. This is extraordinary. This is really extraordinary. The excerpt itself, or this particular discussion, or this portion of the discussion, does focus primarily on the first part. And so the comments, I think, are very relevant to this disc 1. And it's wonderfully presented. We have this intimate and lovely, warm conversation between these two gentlemen, these two artists, focusing on Kobayashi and focusing on, for example, Kobayashi's outlook on this particular work, the Gomikawa work. He's also focusing in or discussing his relationship with Yoshio Miyajima, who is the director of photography. And one of the great aspects of the Human Condition, this part 1 being an example of this, is the camera work, the photography, the look, the capturing of the shadows and the light, the close-ups on the faces, and the expressions of the landscape and the movement of peoples, and the way that light shines in the eyes of the people, whether this means a sense of satisfaction or glory, or this is an indication of desperation and panic. Anyway, the role of Miyajima is so important, and it is, of course, being indicated as such by the fact that Kobayashi is speaking about his relationship with Miyajima in these warm, affectionate terms, and how he's so important. And also in this discussion, Kobayashi reminds us about the production aspects, how this was a Shochiku film, but in terms of the production, this was under Ninjin Club, so it had this sense or streak of independent cinema about it. And also Kobayashi is talking about his admiration for the Gomikawa work. He also speaks about his admiration of the actor Tatsuya Nakadai. And of course, Nakadai is so fundamentally key and important to the success of this particular work. And we will speak more about Nakadai when we talk about an interview that can be found with him as the supplements to the third disc. But for now, we have the comments, the great comments from Kobayashi about Nakadai and about what he brings to the role. Also, the conversation goes into some wonderful details about, for example, how the film they were shooting it, or they were in the process of making the film, and they had finished shooting, but they had not yet assembled the film together. And according to Kobayashi, how it fell was they had completed all the shooting, and all the footage was, they needed to review the footage, and so it happened around the end of December and into the New Year's holiday, where they had to watch all the footage. And then they had to do that in such a rushed schedule because, according to Kobayashi, the film was set to be released in the middle of January, so that doesn't leave much time at all to assemble the final cut of the work. But they were very Kobayashi was recalling how it was a very intense period, an intense time, but they were determined to put together this particular first component, or the first part or parts that would be part of this initial release. And so he seems also to remember the stew, the hot stew that was eaten by this core group on the way to trying to put the film together. And when it came, my goodness, what an effect it had. And Kobayashi does recall that there were some bad reviews, some critical takes on the work, perhaps focusing in on the character of Kaji. And perhaps one of the criticisms that he recalls, and he mentions here about how Kaji was seen by some critics as being maybe overly naive or perhaps too saint-like in terms of his desire to have a stance of morality in this world that is very much a morass when it comes to these very difficult moral related choices. And so some of the critiques or some of the criticisms that Kobayashi recalls, for example, had to do with the character of Kaji, where Kobayashi, however, here and also elsewhere has remarked about how, in fact, the character of Kaji is meant to undergo a type of arc or development that begins in this first part, continues into the second part, and then concludes in the final part. And so his reaction to these criticisms is that those critics didn't get the point about how this was just the first part of a essentially 3-part structure or 6-part structure, which actually is a really nice and subtle way to make the case to regard this work, The Human Condition, as one whole. The fact that we see this really palpable and very dramatic development of the character arc of Kaji. It has its beginnings here, but as we will see in the progress into the second part and the third part, or the progress into up to the conclusion of The Human Condition, we will see how his character reacts and changes or doesn't change, or is maybe in contrast to how he was at the very start. And so it's really nice to have this comment from Kobayashi here, because it reminds us again about how crucial the character arc development of Kaji will be, especially when we get into the continuing parts of The Human Condition. And he also returns to discussion of the filmmaking process, again his work with Miyajima, and Miyajima he had a certain type of character or presence. He is described by Shinoda and Kobayashi as being a person who had himself left-leaning political perspectives that were not unlike Kobayashi's and the character of Kaji, and also the writer Gomikawa as well. And so that meant too that as we know, as we get into the other parts of the work, The Human Condition, we know that this view of the viewpoint of the utopian take of the socialist, the application of socialism in Soviet Russia, how this viewpoint, this utopian viewpoint, is challenged quite dramatically as we get along through The Human Condition. And so this is something that Kobayashi remarked upon in terms of, or as part of the context of his relationship with director of photography. And so it's another, I think, really fascinating aspect of, or another example of how the filmmakers were really trying to invest a lot of what they felt into this work. And the fact that the work is challenging that viewpoint means that these filmmakers are willingly allowing this subject matter to challenge their own views. And perhaps it is a reflection of how they understand or appreciate how really difficult a lot of these choices and a lot of these perspectives are, Kobayashi included. So this is a very fascinating story or anecdote about his working relationship with Miyajima and how it actually has these deep ramifications with the story overall and Kaji and Gomikawa. And also he's talking about storyboards, and there is a little moment, a really lovely moment, where Shinoda and Kobayashi are talking about ozu and the use of storyboards and artwork in order to prepare a particular film or work, and how Ozu had this preference to use different colors of colored pencil, etc., red pencil or blue pencil, etc. And so these, I think, are really lovely examples of how this discussion between these two filmmakers, these two artists, Kobayashi and Shinoda, of course focusing in on Kobayashi and the human condition, these are examples of how this interview or excerpted interview is so crucial. We get the voice and comments from Kobayashi himself. They are wonderful, they are splendid. He is very earnest and sincere, and he is very soft-spoken, and yet he has a force and a will to his comments that is truly extraordinary. So please check this out if you can. This great discussion, again, it is from 1993, well worth it. And then the Disc 1 supplements are rounded out with a trailer for this particular component. Again, this is based upon the release schedule of the human condition works that we saw in Japan, and so the trailer here and also the trailers that we will find on the other discs will correspond with that. So it's a very interesting trailer. Please check it out as well. This is Disc 1, and we will, again, as I say, focus in on Discs 2 and 3, as well as other aspects of this release in separate discussions. I do want to say here that and we'll also focus, I should say, also on the presentation. There are some really interesting details about it. I'll talk about that in a separate discussion. I do want to say here, in the context of Disc 1 and this first component and the supplements, it might seem that here and on other discs, the number of supplements might seem to be somewhat low in terms of the quantity. And especially when we compare it with other, say, Criterion releases that have a lot of documentaries or interviews or other making of specials or short films, etc. Relatively speaking, yes, the number of supplements here is, relatively speaking, low. However, the quantity is so high. The comments from Kobayashi here on this Disc 1 discussion, the comments here are extraordinary. They are extraordinary, and one of the key aspects for me in viewing the human condition is always remembering just how close Kobayashi is with this material. And this discussion reminds me of this so vividly. And it also reminds me of the forcefulness of the power of his art, Kobayashi's art. And so to have this interview is so well worth it, so valuable, and so the quality of this is so high. And again, it is so wonderful that we get comments directly from the filmmaker himself. So in that way, I think the point here is the quality. And the same is true for the other supplements that we will find on discs 2 and 3, the discussion with Shinoda and also the discussion with Nakadai. Each in its own way is utterly brilliant. So this is maybe a little bit of an indication, a precursor, maybe a little bit of a preview of exactly how I might talk about the set as a whole. But let me just say right now that this Criterion release, it is echoing, of course, the earlier DVD release of by Criterion, and I will speak about this as well. There is also perhaps some discussion that can be had in terms of another release of these films from Arrow, and I will talk about that as well. But let me say here, we will continue with discs 2 and 3 discussion, but for right now, this release from Criterion is extraordinary. It is really extraordinary, and I'm so happy that it is now on Blu-ray, and hopefully this means that that many people will be able to watch it and experience it and engage with this work. It is so important, so monumental, so towering, and so important, and so powerful. And we get that sense already in this first part, which is found on disc 1 of this release, of Kobayashi's masterpiece, The Human Condition.